Now that we looked at the actual process of labor under capitalism, I want to look a little bit at the capitalist himself. And again, it's important to understand that Marx doesn't envision like this capitalist pig who's like driving a Bentley and wearing a really nice suit. He really has more in mind like the captain of industry, the self-denying guy who pumps all of his profits back into his business. Not because he wants to, but because he has to, right? Capitalism demands that he competes. And he has to accumulate and accumulate and accumulate, or somebody else is going to put him out of business. So he might drive a really nice car and wear really nice clothes, but he can't keep all of the money that he's making because he has to compete with other capitalists in the marketplace. So, I want to talk next about what we call the paradox of capitalism. And so you would think that the more efficient production gets, the more money that's being made, and some of that money would trickle down to the workers. That's what Reaganomics says, right? But actually, the workers, by this very process, are made poorer and more miserable through the following means. First, they cannot demand higher wages or shorter working hours because of the existence of what we call the Industrial Reserve Army. And this is where Marx talks about capitalism producing its own grave diggers. I'll get a little bit economic-y here for a second, but it's not super important to understand all of the whys and hows of this. But basically, the more as capital continues to accumulate, the part that gets spent on labor goes down, and the part that gets spent on the means of production increases. And so in economic speak, we say that variable capital declines in relation to constant capital. What this means in the real world is that machines are replacing workers. And when machines replace workers, unemployment goes up. Because now we can have one machine that does the work of 10 people. So unemployment is up and people are competing for jobs. Because there's always somebody that wants a job. That army of unemployed people keeps the wages low and prevents the shortening of hours. Because if you go to your boss and you say, hey, I know that I'm making $10 an hour right now, but I want to make $12 an hour, and instead of a 40-hour work week, I want a 37-hour work week. Your boss is going to laugh in your face and say, okay, you're fired, and I'm going to hire a guy off the street that'll work for $8 an hour and $60 hours a week because he needs the job. And there's always someone that needs the job. So this is how capitalism, kind of implodes on itself. Because even though it's dynamic and it's super productive, it offers really terrible conditions to the people who work under it. You're always afraid that the market's going to slump. You're always worried about unemployment and other crises of capitalism. Your living conditions are terrible, right? Generally. So it's actually the experience of capitalism that will bring the proletariat together as a class. And eventually they're gonna stop trying to compromise and they'll challenge the system through trade unions and political parties. And so here's where Marx talks about that on page 67. I love this line, the bourgeoisie, it has resolved personal worth into exchange value. Basically all we are commodities. The only value we have is what goods we can produce and what work we can do and sell on the open market. So, that's all I have to say really about the productive, the mode of production, the economic system, and now let's talk about the superstructure of society. And this is where I think, you can really see Marx's theory in action in our society today. So you might hear the superstructure referred to as the ideology sometimes. What this means is the ways in which our media, our religion, our books, and our educational institutions disseminate a worldview that corresponds to the interests of the ruling classes. So, it's a little hard to explain, but one thing you can think about is American history, right? When you take an American history class and you look at the textbook and you see that the people who are celebrated in the textbook are the ones who are capitalists, right? They're the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the people who have, the captains of industry. Those are the people who the textbook values. And people like Eugene Debs, right? The ones who are the socialists. They're seen as criminals. Because the people in charge are trying to give you this worldview of, hey, it's good to be a capitalist and it's good to make money, and that's the American way, right? And so you see these ideas, they validate capitalism and exploitation and individualism. They don't call them that. They call them freedom because that's patriotic. But it's the way in which capitalism sort of pervades everything that we consume. So he's got an example of this on page 80. Your very ideas are the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property. So anytime we talk about something like justice, we're actually talking about the justice that the ruling class has sort of manufactured, the idea of justice that the ruling class has manufactured for us. And I mean, it's important to understand that in Marx's view, the bourgeoisie, it's not their fault, because again, economics operates independently of human will, so it really isn't the fault of the bourgeoisie, because they don't see this either. But basically, until we achieve communism, we are slaves to historical necessity, and everything we think is rigidly determined by the current mode of production. So everything that I believe and am taught and consume in media is shaped in some way by capitalism. That includes relationships, right? And so Marx talks a lot about marriage and how it's this capitalist sham. Our religions, right? And so one of the examples you'll look at for the voice thread is how capitalism and Christianity have become fused together, and our education, and even the language that we use. It's all bound up in the language of capitalism. So we're always talking about profits and increasing profits and stuff like that. And that's the way that we see capitalism as like this disease that affects our collective consciousness. I mean, I mentioned this a second ago, but the upshot of this view is that it's the system that's to blame. It's not individuals. So actually evil is totally independent of human will. But it can only be abolished when we sort of walk through all of the steps of history. So when the perfect human community is brought into existence. Until then, we just sort of have to go along for the ride. I want to talk about alienation a little bit because that's important too. So the act of working is actually this alienating process. Number one, because the worker doesn't have any stake in what he produces. It's not an expression of himself. So he no longer experiences the product of his work as an extension of himself. So the example I always give is like, I could make a loaf of bread by hand, or I could use my bread machine. And when I make the loaf of bread by hand, I'm kneading the dough, and, I put my blood, sweat, and tears into that loaf of bread. So when it comes out of the oven, I'm like, oh, I made this, and it's really great. Whereas on the bread machine, I dump the ingredients in, I push a button, and there out pops the bread, right? So I don't experience that end product, which is the bread, as some kind of extension of anything that I've done. So I become alienated from the product of my labor. All I get at the end of the day when I'm working this crappy job are some crappy wages that aren't enough to live on. I also am alienated from the actual process of labor itself. So I don't express myself in the work that I do, I lose myself in it. So if all I'm doing is pressing a button on a machine all day, or operating some kind of factory equipment that doesn't take, that a monkey could do, that's not enjoyable, and that's not actually the way we should be working. So alienation. And the relationship we have with our work under industrial capitalism, the solution to all of that is eliminating private property, alienated labor, and wages, and that's what communism entails. So Marx knows that, oh my gosh, you want us to do away with private property, and you want to take away my toothbrush. But Marx isn't talking about personal property like, I own this bottle of Pepsi right here. Marx is talking about the fact that 1% of the population owns 99% of the resources. And, you actually, you own a little tiny piece of land, but you don't really own anything. It's on a mortgage, and the big businesses and the companies, and those are the people that actually own everything. Okay, so what we're after with Marxism is, the goal is communism, but the real goal is what I like to refer to as the liberation of human capacities, and that includes eliminating greed. we're actually only greedy right now because we have to be, right? Marx says that it's because we live under the system of capitalism that we have to be self-interested, because it's sink or swim out there. If I don't work my butt off, I'm going to be homeless. So I have to compete and I have to work as hard as I can. But we wouldn't have to engage in that kind of competition and that kind of self-interest if the relations of production would change, because that would change our culture and our ethics, because remember, it's all tied up in economics. And once we achieve communism, we'll realize that the good of ourselves can be found in working for the good of society. So when we end alienation and domination of some people by other classes and others and classes and private ownership of the means of production and exploitation, when all of this stuff has disappeared, here's where it gets a little weird. Marx says we won't need a state anymore, because basically the government, the way it functions now, it just works to reinforce the goals of the upper class. Another big thing about Marx is that he thinks that religion is a function of not capitalism, but it certainly does function as like an arm of capitalism, but it really just is like a pill that we take, because our situations under industrial capitalism are so terrible that we pop this pill every day that says all you have to do is work hard and then you'll die and you'll go to heaven. So this misery that I experience on earth is temporary. And Marx says we use religion to cope with how bad our lives are under capitalism. But once that oppression is gone, the need for religion will disappear, because the reasons for the existence of religion will ultimately be eliminated. So that's my best take on Marx that I can give you. If you have any questions, because I know this one was really difficult, just shoot me a message.